My name is Casey Morgan. I'm 24 years old, and this is how I took revenge on the brother who laughed at my broken shoes. Like I was nothing, only for the universe to put him in his place 5 minutes later. I was standing in my father's boutique, a little family-owned fashion shop tucked between overpriced cafés and cold glass storefronts in New York, pretending to help organize samples while trying to ignore the way my soles peeled with every step. The rubber flapped audibly when I moved, like a bad joke. I kept my head down, hoping no one would notice. But of course Logan did. My older brother, the golden child, who always walked like the world belonged to him. He looked at my feet and gave this loud, exaggerated gasp. "Jesus, Casey," he said, pointing as two of the younger salesgirls looked up. "I didn't know we were hiring homeless people now." He laughed hard, as if it were the best joke he'd made all week. The girls joined in with these awkward, nervous giggles. Our dad, who still flinched whenever Logan opened his mouth, let out this weak chuckle like he knew it was wrong but didn't have the energy to stop it. I stood there frozen, the heat rushing up my neck, burning my ears. I felt like someone had peeled back my skin and left me exposed in the middle of the store. I didn't say a word. I just pressed my lips together so hard they ached. That's what I always did. Swallowed it. Let him win. I turned to leave, just wanting to get to the back room and out of sight before I cried. I had made it halfway across the floor when the bell above the door rang. This sharp, chiming sound that always meant some Upper East Sider with money to burn had just walked in. I didn't even look up until I heard the voice. "Excuse me," the man said, and everyone turned. He was tall, in this razor-cut gray suit with leather gloves in one hand and this intense look on his face. Like everything he saw bored him, until his eyes landed on me. "You," he said, pointing. My breath caught. He stepped closer, eyes fixed on my shoes. "Who designed those?" The room went dead quiet. Logan's mouth opened, then closed. My dad frowned, confused. The man looked around impatiently. "I've been looking for a designer who understands raw street resilience. That's what this is, isn't it?" I couldn't even answer. My tongue was cement. He nodded, almost to himself. "Can we talk?" Everyone stared at me like I'd just pulled a rabbit from a trash bag. I looked down at my wrecked sneakers, the ones I'd stitched back together with thread and hope. Then I looked up. That was the moment everything changed. I grew up in a world stitched with silk and expectation. Morgan Aitlier, the family-owned fashion business, was my childhood playground. It started with my grandfather, a quiet man with calloused hands who believed clothes could speak when people couldn't. He built the Aitlier from scratch, tailoring suits out of his apartment until the neighborhood started calling him the gentleman's ghost. Always working behind the scenes, always precise. When he passed, my father took over, trading the intimacy of craft for the cold polish of branding. Everything became about image. And Logan, my older brother, fit that image perfectly. He was the golden boy from day one. Sharp-featured, Ivy League bound, a walking business card. My father saw in him the legacy he wanted. Preppy, clean-cut, someone who looked good on magazine pages. And then there was me. I was the smudge in the corner of the portrait, hands always stained with ink or dye, barefoot in the back room, with scissors in my teeth and a dozen half-finished sketches at my feet. I was never what they wanted. I didn't speak the language of investors or runway trends. I spoke in color palettes and stitched seams. My ideas were too raw, too messy, to mine. I taught myself the trade from the scraps they left behind. Studying textiles after closing hours, sneaking peeks at invoices, offering to help at shoots just to be near the process. But in their eyes, I was always the helper, never the designer. I was given backroom tasks, unpaid design drafts, coffee runs, and silence. When our mother died, the divide turned to a chasm. She had been the only one who noticed me, who touched my sketches with reverence, not disdain. With her gone, Logan slid into leadership like it was a throne, and my father became a shadow, still present, but colder, unreachable. He handed Logan the reins like he'd been waiting for the excuse. And me, I stayed. Maybe out of hope, maybe out of stubbornness, maybe just because I didn't know who I was without the atelier. I sketched every day, even when my hands ached. I learned fabrics by feel, trained my eye to spot stitch tension from yards away. I watched, waited, volunteered, and still, I was invisible. The only person who ever made me feel seen was Maya, a friend from college. Another oddball with paint in her hair and no patience for pretense. She once told me, "The world will catch up to you. You just have to survive until it does." But surviving, I've learned, isn't pretty. It means biting your tongue so hard it bleeds. It means being laughed at by your own blood while folding clothes you helped design. It means finding your first real original, the sketch you drew in your journal at 16, pouring your heart into every line, reposted years later on Logan's Instagram, his name in bold underneath it. No credit, no mention, just a sea of likes. When I brought it up, my father looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Family loyalty matters more than ego." I swallowed that betrayal like poison, and I stayed. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd get another chance, that someone would notice. But chances never came. Now I live in a cramped rented room in Queens, where the walls leak in the rain and my neighbors argue through the drywall. I take freelance gigs online, logo edits, tailoring advice, small custom jobs, enough to keep my phone on and ramen in the cupboard. My shoes have holes. My fingers are calloused. But I'm still here. I still dream. I dream of building something that's mine, without Logan's shadow over it, without my father's silence crushing it. Something honest. Something real, something that speaks for people like me, the ones no one expects to win at first. I thought it was a joke, a weird, cruel setup. Tyrell Banks, creative director of URB and Grit, one of the most viral streetwear brands out of LA, pointing at my busted sneakers like they were a work of art. Everyone in the boutique froze. Logan looked confused. My dad blinked like he'd misheard. And me, I just stood there, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear myself whisper, "They're just old shoes, patched by hand." Tyrell's eyes lit up. "Exactly," he said, stepping closer like he was studying something rare. "That's the story I want to tell. Real, lived in, resilient." I didn't know what to say. I waited for someone to laugh, to call it performance art, a prank, something. But Tyrell wasn't kidding. He told me he was in New York for a Collab pop-up, scouting raw design voices that hadn't been watered down by corporate branding. He said he'd been walking by when he saw the shoes through the window, the makeshift stitching, the duct tape at the sole, the way they held together like a dare, and walked in on instinct. Logan immediately tried to step in, flashing his practiced smile and saying I was just a helper, that anything I worked on was part of the family studio. But Tyrell didn't even look at him. He cut him off mid-sentence. Not today, he said flatly. Then he looked back at me, pulled a card from his coat, and handed it over. Tyrell Banks, creative director. URB and grit. My fingers shook when I took it. You've got 24 hours, he said. Send me a concept. Raw, unfiltered, no noise. Let's see if it's real. And just like that, he walked out, like he'd dropped a bomb and moved on. The boutique stayed silent for a full 10 seconds before Logan let out this incredulous scoff. Like the idea of someone choosing me over him was just too absurd to process. But I was already walking out, gripping the card like a life preserver. That night, I didn't sleep. I worked in my tiny rented room, surrounded by scraps of old denim and thrifted canvas. I pulled out everything I had: sketches, photos, hand-mended jackets, frayed cuffs, hand-painted linings. I laid it all bare. My past, my pain, my pride. I made mood boards with torn-up notebook pages and candids of my closet floor. I stitched memories into every slide. I built the deck not like I was pitching a product, but like I was fighting for my life. Just before dawn, I closed the file, ready to send. But the email bounced. Then another. Then the folder vanished. My laptop restarted, glitching like it had been gutted. I sat frozen, breath caught in my throat, praying it was some glitch. But it wasn't. Logan had gotten to it. I found out hours later. My deck deleted. My files wiped. My father stood in the studio, arms crossed, disappointment etched into every line of his face. Logan said you were trying to poach clients from the family business, he said quietly. That's not how we do things. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to ask when I stopped being family. I ran upstairs, tried to salvage the file, but it was gone. Everything. Gone. I found Logan by the front window, sipping espresso like he owned the air. He didn't even pretend to lie. You really thought someone like you would be taken seriously, he said, laughing like it was obvious. Tyrell's not looking for pity projects. He'll forget you by noon. My vision blurred with rage. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stood there, the silence between us stretching into something unbearable, because I realized something in that moment. They weren't ever going to give me a seat at the table. They were never going to believe in me, respect me, or even see me. I could have stitched masterpieces from blood and thread, and they'd still call me just a helper. So I made a decision. Right then. Right there. If they were going to treat me like I didn't exist, I'd build something so undeniable they'd choke on their silence. Casey sat on the floor of Maya's cramped studio apartment, her back against a crate of tangled extension cords, her thumbs hovering over her phone. The message she had typed to Tyrell was raw to raw. Maybe. She reread it twice, hesitated, and then hit send. She told him everything. How Logan had stolen her designs, passed them off as his own, and left her reputation in shreds. How their father had taken his side, saying Casey was too emotional for business, as if passion were a liability. How she had walked out with nothing but a sketchbook and a heart full of spite. She wasn't sure what she expected in return. Sympathy, maybe, a polite brush off at worst. But Tyrell's reply landed like a spark on dry grass. That actually makes your story stronger. Let's do it. The next morning, a notification hit her phone. Tyrell had wired her just enough money to build 3 prototypes. Nothing luxurious, just enough to survive, scrape, and prove herself. 10 days. That was the window. She dropped her phone and exhaled, half in disbelief, half in panic. She had 10 days to build something from almost nothing. She grabbed her duffel, called Maya, and crashed on her floor that night. No questions asked, just a hug and a shared pizza. From that moment on, Casey didn't sleep. She shut down. Emotionally. Physically, she went silent. Her body moved like it was on borrowed time. She dumpster dived behind fabric stores for scrap leather, cut thread from old bedsheets, repurposed metal from broken zippers and defunct purses. She borrowed Maya's machine and kept it humming through the night, the rhythmic worklick of the needle stitching her anger into shape. Her hands bled from pins and wire, her back ached from sleeping upright, but her focus never wavered in a jagged montage of memory and motion. The past clawed at her. Logan smirking in the boardroom, wearing her design on the runway. Their father's voice so cold, so final, saying she needed to toughen up, like empathy was a curse. The night she stayed up until dawn, sketching designs that he would later photocopy and claim as his own. Too emotional, he'd said. Too much. Heart, not enough bite. But now that very heart was driving her hands, making every stitch scream with purpose. This wasn't a comeback. This was a declaration. After 5 sleepless days, she sent the first prototypes to Tyrell's team. Then silence. Hours turned into a full day. Her chest ached with the weight of uncertainty. But when the call came, it was short and electric. "You're flying to LA." Casey collapsed into Maya's arms. No time for celebration. Just packing. Just movement. Los Angeles buzzed with a different kind of energy, faster, shinier, full of edges she could sharpen herself against. Tyrell's team took one look at her prototypes and nodded. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. They saw it. She was the storm. Within days, they launched the capsule collection under a name Casey had scribbled in a margin months ago, when she still believed in second chances. Broken, not buried. The designs were raw and jagged, asymmetrical and bruised, like they had clawed their way out of grief and stitched themselves back together. The internet didn't explode, it simmered. Quietly at first. A TikTok creator styled one of her pieces with steel-toe boots and trauma-laced poetry. Then a streetwear blog ran a short piece. Casey Vega is rewriting the rules. A Gen Z influencer posted a crying selfie in a broken, not buried jacket. "I've never felt more seen." The caption read, "It wasn't just fashion. It was pain turned to armor." And people got it. Somewhere in New York, Logan stood on a Fashion Week stage presenting a line that looked like a watered-down tribute to their father's old catalog. Stale cuts, nostalgic nonsense, expensive wool and empty meaning. The critics were polite, but bored. The reviews trickled in like knives. Uninspired, out of touch, an echo of past relevance. Meanwhile, Casey's inbox filled with press requests and collaboration offers. Tyrell took her to dinner and laid out numbers, real ones. A full-time deal, a studio, a team. "You could build an empire," he said, eyes shining. Casey looked at the contract and smiled. "I'm flattered," she said, pushing it back gently. "But I've got my own blueprints." Because revenge, she'd come to realize, wasn't about humiliating them. It wasn't about standing on Logan's ashes or dragging their father's name through the dirt. It was about something cleaner, harder, realer. It was about becoming undeniable, so real they had no choice but to look at her differently. Or not at all. She walked back to Maya's apartment that night, her boots heavy with exhaustion, her mind already sketching the next idea. The city lights blurred into streaks, but she felt sharp. Sharp enough to cut through the noise. Months had passed, but the fire in Casey hadn't dulled. It had settled into something sharper, steadier. She had become a name whispered with reverence in underground ateliers and fashion classrooms. Called the face of the anti-runway movement. Clothes that told stories instead of selling fantasies. Her designs didn't shimmer, they cut. And when the invitation arrived to speak on a panel titled Emerging Voices in Fashion, she almost laughed. She wasn't emerging. She'd forced her way through. The auditorium was a slow build of quiet murmurs and flashing cameras. Casey took her seat on stage in worn boots and a structured jacket from her broken, not buried line, clean lines, distressed edges, every stitch deliberate. She scanned the crowd, breath caught for half a second. There, in the third row, sat Logan and their father, stiff, uncomfortable, out of place among the raw denim and industrial tailoring. But they were there, not by pride or even curiosity, but because a major investor, young, rich, and evangelical about Casey's work, had demanded their presence. He had made it clear any future deals with them hinged on understanding her. The moderator introduced her, voice bright, rattling off accolades she hadn't had time to internalize. Then the mic was hers. She didn't perform. She didn't smile. She just spoke. And the room leaned in. Casey told the story without venom, only truth. Of her first design being taken. Of her voice being reduced to silence in boardrooms she once cleaned after hours. Of watching her name be erased so someone else could spell his in all caps. I thought maybe I was too soft for this world, she said, her voice steady, until someone looked at my work and said, no, you're just too real for theirs. For a long breath, the room held its silence, heavy and reverent. Then it erupted. Not polite applause, roars, cheers, whistles, stomps on the concrete floor. The investor stood, clapping slowly, watching Casey like a prophet in a temple she built with her bare hands. Afterwards, backstage hummed with congratulations. Logan slipped through the crowd like a ghost, suddenly all warmth and nostalgia. We should reconnect, he said, voice dripping with curated sincerity. It'd be great to work together again. Casey didn't flinch. She turned to face him fully, her eyes calm but brutal. You used to laugh at my broken shoes, she said quietly. Now you walk in the ruins of what you tried to build without me. She didn't wait for his reaction. There was no anger left, just clarity. She walked past him as the investor stepped forward, beaming, hand outstretched with a contract meant for her, not the men who had once silenced her. Logan stood in place, fading into the background noise, as Casey walked into the future he once tried to steal. The sky was overcast when Casey stepped onto the gravel path that led to her mother's grave. The silence of the cemetery was a soft kind, the kind that didn't ask for anything, just a place to exhale. She carried two things with her, a single white lily and a folded piece of fabric, one of her earliest designs, stitched back in the days when belief in herself felt like defiance. She knelt down, brushing the dust off the headstone with her sleeve, and placed the flower gently at its base. Then, carefully, she slid the folded design beneath a small, flat rock, a quiet offering, not for approval, not even for closure, just acknowledgement. Her mother had never seen her succeed. But now, Casey didn't need anyone's permission to feel whole. Back in the city, her life moved with a steady rhythm. No chaos, no desperate need to prove anything. She ran her own label now, Mended, a name that once felt like survival, now felt like truth. She employed 6 people, all of them outsiders in their own way. Artists who'd been overlooked, seamstresses who'd been told they were too slow, interns who had been passed over for being too weird or not polished enough. Casey didn't need polish. She needed grit, heart, people who understood that fashion wasn't about gloss. It was about expression. She had found her people, and together they built something that mattered. Maya was her marketing director now. Same Maya who once let her crash on the floor, who kept her fed with coffee and belief when Casey couldn't afford either. They worked out of a shared studio above a thrift store, the windows fogged in winter, and the pipes always groaning. But the space was theirs. Laughter filled it often. So did music, ideas, the sound of machines and possibility. Orders came in from everywhere, not in mass quantities, but in careful, thoughtful waves. Her customers didn't want trends. They wanted connection. Real people with real stories wore her designs now. A teacher who lost everything in a divorce and stitched herself back together in a mended jacket. A cancer survivor who wore her battle scars like embroidery. A teenager who saved all her allowance for a coat that made her feel strong. Casey wasn't famous. She didn't need to be. She had something deeper than fame, resonance. Every email she received, every tagged photo on social media, reminded her that what she was building mattered. Not in a headline way, in a human way. Her father never apologized. That chapter remained unwritten, and she had stopped waiting for the pen to move. Logan moved to Miami with some vague plan to start over, opening a minimalist boutique in a city that didn't really care for his brand of recycled privilege. She heard things now and then, struggles, ego bruises, a failed collaboration. But there was no satisfaction in it, no victory, just distance. And that was the truest sign that she had healed, the absence of hate. There was no bitterness in her bones anymore, no sharp edges waiting to cut back, just space for growth, for gratitude, for whatever came next. Some evenings, she stayed late in the studio, sewing long after the others had gone home. The hum of the machine steady, the radio playing low. In those quiet hours, she thought about everything that had broken her, and how none of it had buried her. It had built her, piece by piece, and now she wore those seams with pride, not as wounds, as proof. There's a moment each morning just before the sun spills over the fire escapes when the world feels suspended. In that hush, Casey sometimes pauses by the window of her studio, coffee cooling in her hands, breath rising in small clouds against the glass. It's in that quiet that she reflects, not with regret, but with reverence. She used to think silence meant survival, that shrinking herself, keeping her head down, staying agreeable, those were the terms of existence. She thought being small would keep the peace. But the peace never came, just more erasure. More rooms she wasn't allowed to take up space in. Now, her world is louder, but in a grounded way. It hums with thread, with stories, with presence. Broken shoes, she's learned, still walk forward. Scuffed and frayed and ignored. Maybe, but they keep moving. And so did she. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but onward. Every time someone steps into one of her designs, someone who's been overlooked, underestimated, told they were too much or not enough, she feels it, a pulse of connection that transcends trend or fabric. These weren't just clothes, they were armor, proof, a kind of quiet rebellion stitched into every seam. She thinks of the girl she used to be, the one who sketched alone in the margins, who stayed quiet in meetings while her ideas were claimed by louder mouths, the girl who got laughed at for the way she dressed, for how much she felt, for daring to care. Casey doesn't carry shame for her anymore. She carries gratitude. She thanks that girl every day for not disappearing, for staying alive long enough to become something solid, something undeniable, and in that, there's no need for a final triumph. Just this moment, this stillness, this truth. She made something real, and she didn't vanish. That was always the win.